All right, welcome back to Fantasy Sports Today here on SportsGrid, our supersized edition of the show. Craig Mish along with Davis Maddock, Matt Stryker, and Joe Pisapia. Gentlemen, it is Super Bowl Sunday, just a few hours away from getting the game going. Matt Stryker, I don't know, man. When I picture you watching a Super Bowl Sunday, I picture calm and relax. The family's just around. The Super Bowl's on. It's not in the background, but let's be honest, it's a little bit in the background too. Matt's got other things going on. He's very have I painted the correct picture of your Super Bowl,
Well,
or am I way off? And like all the families coming over and everyone's going nuts. There's beers everywhere. I don't know. I
no,
kind of
no,
get
no,
the
no,
sense of if you want to watch a
no.
Super Bowl at the Stryker household, you got to be chill. Am I crazy?
Well, yes, you're crazy, but that's a conversation for another 4-hour show. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, as well as a wife, and currently 3 dogs running around. So if you think, here's the funny thing, when I want something to get done, I sit down. Because the minute I sit down, I'll hear one of 2 things. Daddy or honey. And I go, oh, look, something needs to be done. So the Super Bowl in my world, it exists. It's a game. I'm aware. The device is a big best friend because daddy has to go to the bathroom more often than one would think. Wink, wink, because daddy needs to check his phone. That's how I've got to do it these days, but I'm not complaining, Craig.
Yeah. I've been there, Matt. I've been there. Eventually it gets easier. It
I
gets
love it.
easier, as Joe could attest to. And, Davis maybe has, kids all around the country he doesn't know about. But other than that, it's a much stronger situation for Davis. Guys, let's go into the fact that these two teams played each other. Yeah, he didn't like that one. Let's go into the fact that these two teams play each other more recently, back in 2020. Joe, do you put anything into previous matchups here? It seems like everyone is talking about avenging a loss, so to speak. But outside of Mahomes and Kelsey and a couple of other key figures on both sides, it does feel like these are completely two different rosters, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. The key pieces, as you mentioned, it's Reed, Kelsey, Mahomes. Those pieces are still all in play, and I think those are the most important pieces. Now, on the flip side of this, too, the last time the 49ers were facing the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, you had Jimmy Garoppolo under center. Now, another system quarterback in this system that has been very prolific for Kyle Shanahan. And Brock Purdy's done a fantastic job of running that system. It deserves a ton of credit. There's a lot of Brock Purdy hate out there. There's a lot of Brock Purdy love also. He's a very divisive guy. I think Brock Purdy's done a really good job of running this offense, and it's a lot easier when you have somebody like Christian McCaffrey. That, to me, is the X factor. You asked before earlier in hour one, how did the 49ers win this game? I said it's the over, and I think it's really Christian McCaffrey getting over that century mark or close to it in terms of rushing yards, because I think that's how you attack the Kansas City Chiefs. I'm sure Davis will agree. That's the weakness still of that defense. You can run at them, utilize that speed, get Deebo Samuel the football in the backfield too, try to get these guys running up and down the field, tire out that defense a little bit. But, I continue to, look at that 2020, and the one thing that keeps coming up for me that I think does matter is the moments where Kyle Shanahan sometimes is too smart for his own good. Sometimes doesn't take advantage of the clock the way he should. Sometimes there's moments that he misses, I think, as a head coach that you just can't do in this sort of game. And I think that's the big advantage in terms of that chess match that Andy Reid and Kyle Shanahan are going to play today.
I mean, I definitely think that these teams don't like each other, as evidenced by the 49ers crying all week. We got Bosa was complaining about how Taylor never gets called for his obvious holds. Jawan Taylor led the NFL in holds called, by the way, for anyone who's just trying to fact check what the 49ers are saying. The 49ers got woken up 7 minutes before their alarm by our fire alarm poll on Wednesday. So you've got 5 days before the Super Bowl. You wake up 7 minutes before your team-mandated alarm. It was all that anyone wanted to talk about. McCaffrey was complaining about it. The defensive players were complaining about it. They said that everyone was tired and lethargic at practice. Come on, guys. The only thing that we had missing was for one of the 49ers to start crying about Taylor Swift. That really would have sent it over the top if one of the 49ers been like, oh, my God, enough of the Taylor Swift. I think no one just wants to draw the ire of the Swift army. I think that if they were not so afraid of the online complaints that they would get for complaining about the Swift Army, I think that we probably would have gone in that direction. It really would not surprise me for Shanahan to feel some, a little bit of a rivalry against Andy Reid. And make no mistake about it, this will be a rivalry moving forward. You can't play a team twice in the Super Bowl and not have some kind of AFC versus NFC rivalry start to generate. I mean, it's just not really the way it works. We see these in sports, Cavs Warriors. That was just like every season. We just waited for Cavs Warriors, and when they would play in the regular season, it would be a big deal. I think we'll see the same thing between these two teams. And we've gotten an hour into this show, and no one has brought up a guy who's not on the 49ers roster anymore who could have made this entire story and saga differently. The former number 3 overall pick, Trey Lance. Because why did the San Francisco 49ers trade up to select Trey Lance? Well, it was because the last time the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers played in a Super Bowl, Jimmy Garoppolo could not quarterback his way out of a wet paper bag. He missed a wide open Emmanuel Sanders for what would have been a 70-yard touchdown. He took some bad sacks. Overall, just looked like the game was too big for him. It caused Kyle Shanahan to go in an entirely different direction than every other quarterback Kyle Shanahan has ever coached in his life, right? I want someone mobile. I want someone big. I want someone strong. I want someone who can play outside of structure. I really would love to go through a sliding glass doors of what would have happened if Lance never got injured and Kyle Shanahan just really did try and make it work with this guy, or the sliding glass door of what would have happened if they took Mac Jones or Justin Fields with that 3rd overall pick. What kind of 49ers roster would we be looking at right now? But I just, in all this Super Bowl conversation, it feels like every angle is so overdone and you can't mention anything. I really have not heard anyone mention that the 49ers still have the same fundamental problem that they have had the entire time Shanahan has been their coach, which is that they have all these amazing skill position players, maybe the best play caller in the NFL, and no one wants to go to bat and say, well, they have the better quarterback in the game. It's just not what anyone says about the 49ers in these spots. So I just find that kind of interesting that no one, Craig, has mentioned Lance's name like once that I've heard.
Yeah, Matt, I want to go to Matt here for a minute because Matt's going to take the 49ers in the game. And it feels like to me, and we're going to hit on Tom Brady a little bit when we talk about the Super Bowls coming up, that the narrative is not to fade Mahomes because of the Super Bowl. It feels, Matt, like that to me because everyone is going back to using the same analysis with Tom Brady in the Super Bowl. Tom Brady, of course, won the majority of those Super Bowls. I would also say, Matt, he did not cover in all of those Super Bowls as well. So I find it interesting because while Mahomes is on the trajectory for Brady, he isn't Brady yet.
No, not at all. And he will be if he can do it. But dynamite insight and analysis by Davis. And a good analyst can make someone during the break that's coming up rethink some of their thoughts. I think I'm going to go do that when we come back. More FS2.
.47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course, you're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back weeks throwing one touchdown pass, right? You can't win MVP with one touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs.
but I bet on them. This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's one game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, 7th in assists, and 8th in field goal percentage not make the All-Star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the fourth quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the two biggest games of the two Super Bowls, one as the coordinator, one as a head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the fourth quarter. I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Welcome back to Fantasy Sports Today on SportsGrid. 4 hours of fantasy football content, sports betting content, leading you up till noon Eastern as we continue to talk about some of the great all-time Super Bowl performances. My favorite one of all time is not here, so I'll give that to you at the end. But gentlemen, what would a Super Bowl discussion be without the greatest quarterback of all time, and that is Tom Brady. And Davis, I'll start off with you here on this one. As we go through some of the great performances, I'll never forget watching that Falcons-Patriots game, taking the Falcons plus the points, looking at the game at halftime, thinking to myself, you know what? Even if Brady pulls off this incredible comeback, I'm feeling really good taking the points and the Falcons here. And my gosh, I don't know that I've ever been more upset watching the Super Bowl because I felt like that was the right side. If you took the Falcons, I don't care who won that game. I mean, you had the right side. You had the points in that game. 25 points down, 466 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. My least favorite Super Bowl ever because it ended up being just a disaster from a betting perspective.
So, I had the Patriots money line in this game, and this was right kind of at the start of when I was really getting into sports betting. Right when there were avenues to do it. I believe it was my first year out of college. And Craig, I remember being so distraught at halftime, just being like, how could I have gotten this so wrong? What am I doing? I was so confident. How is this even happening to me? And then, of course, learning a great lesson, which is that you bet against Brady, and it's just not really ever that fun to be on the other side. And funnily enough that we are bringing up this specific game because who gets the most blame for that game? If you want to go back and historically look at why the 28-3, who is the guy calling the plays that led to the 28-3 and the guy who still answers questions about this game to this day on almost every press conference he does? The head coach of the San Francisco 49ers, Kyle Shanahan.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying, Craig.
Oh, you're saying.
I am saying something about Kyle Shanahan here.
I have a great memory of this game as a Patriots fan, obviously. This is the one to me where if you didn't like the Patriots, I get it. I understand Patriots fatigue was real. If you didn't think Tom Brady was the GOAT, I think this was the game where you had to just kind of throw your hands up and say, yeah. I mean, you could say this is the greatest performance because of the deficit and coming back and willing this team to victory and the great plays that Edelman made and James White made. Everybody, it was an incredible performance. 466 passing yards, incredible. But my favorite part was I was watching this with a big group of people, friends over at my house, and one of my friends was a Giants fan, and he was wearing that Giants hat. In the second half of that game at halftime, I took his hat and I put it in the freezer, and I said, your Giants hat is bad mojo. Every time I see a Giants thing, bad things happen to Tom Brady. We put the hat in the freezer, folks. Next thing you know, Patriots come back and win that football game. I'm just saying, Craig. I'm just saying.
Yeah, no, look, I remember watching it, and my son, my daughter is still not into football. She's following Joe's acting career here and singing. But my son, had never really understood. I think he was young at the time, and I think I said, "You go to bed, man. This game's over, 28-3." Yeah, I was totally wrong about that game. Now, Matt, as we go and we talk about these other Super Bowl performances, and certainly, Matt, I think that you can speak to this. There was an era of time where we got these incredible Super Bowl statistical performances, but for about 20 years, the Super Bowl, Matt, it stunk, right? Like every other year was a blowout. What would we hope for on Super Bowl Sunday? We would just hope the game was close. People don't remember. Now, the last 20 years of Super Bowls, we've gotten a lot of good games, but from the 80s into the 90s, before free agency really hit, you had these dynasties like the Cowboys and now the Commanders, but previously Washington Redskins. Right. The Raiders and these games were just not fun at all. And when the 49ers were going, Matt, it was Joe Montana, but more importantly, even with Steve Young, it was Jerry Rice. Jerry Rice would dominate virtually every game that he was playing in. Now, they did play, of course, a close game against the Bengals here in South Florida, one of the best Super Bowls of all time as well. But to me, those are my memories of the 80s and 90s, is going over friends' houses or watching the games in my house, watching Jerry Rice, watching Joe Montana, and thinking it's going to be a blowout. It's just a matter of how many points these guys end up scoring.
Well, I never want to be in the camp of, hey, in my day, it was great, and get off my lawn. We live in a much different world where we have far more superior toys available to us. So if we hold up today's game and today's experiences against the experiential nature of being young, I can see where you're saying that. But everyone has a different perspective, and I think fun is a subjective word. You said you went with your friends. Me, Super Bowls, I was with my dad. And he would explain what Joe said, the game of inches and the little nuances. So while everyone's screaming for that big Jerry Rice play, or when Doug Williams was on, my dad was explaining to me the reason that Doug Williams had that time, or why Art Monk was open. You see what Gary Clark did there? So for me, it was always enjoyable. And I'm hopeful that in today's game, with all of the toys we have, we can still have that human connection. It's not just smarter on SportsGrid isn't just a slogan, right? It is smarter because of the conversations guys like Joe and Davis are having that make you go, you know something? I never spent 5 seconds thinking about that because I'm too busy being told what to think by this. And that to me is the difference, Craig.
All right. Well, listen, for Matt, he sees it as, nostalgic, and I certainly get that. But Joe, when Doug Williams, was in that Super Bowl against Washington, arguably the best game of his life, never, let's be honest, Doug Williams was never great before and he was never great after. He had a long career in the NFL as like a starter and a backup. He had 340 yards and 42 unanswered points in Washington's Super Bowl. These were like the Hog days. If I'm not mistaken, I think, wasn't it Jay Schrader that was the starting quarterback for Washington during that season?
It was.
Yeah, and then he got a big payday from the Raiders. He left. Doug Williams stayed. Doug Williams' career was like over, just immediately after that. Go ahead.
Doug
Joe.
Williams did get hurt after that too. Well, the thing with Doug Williams is, it's hard to be good when you're playing with the tangerine uniform Tampa Bay Buccaneers out of the gate. So it's kind of tough for him to be good in one of the worst football teams in the history of the NFL. Then he goes to Washington, is the backup there. Schrader gets hurt. He comes in, takes him all the way to the Super Bowl. There was some controversy with replacing him and all that stuff. 340 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, and he scored 42 unanswered points on the Broncos. That was a pretty impressive performance, there's no doubt. Unfortunately, then injuries kind of took over there. But the other amazing, pieces, you got to talk about 2 49er quarterbacks. So all you 49er fans that hate that Davis and I were talking about the Chiefs today, how about Montana's performance? 331, 3 touchdowns, 59 rushing yards in one Super Bowl. And, of course, that Steve Young performance as well against the then San Diego Chargers, where he rushed for 49 yards through 6 touchdowns. Craig, I remember you talk about some of the games being kind of not fun. This was fun to watch unless you were a Chargers fan, because I remember that one distinctly of watching the 49ers just completely blow out the Chargers in that game. And you don't always see that either. That to me is a little bit more rare. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think, and also, Davis is, different era thinking through this. On Washington's team, you had this running back named Timmy Smith. When the Raiders were winning Super Bowls, you had this guy named Marcus Allen. You had John Riggins. And Davis, now we have Christian McCaffrey in the Super Bowl as sort of a throwback, but essentially, Davis, the last, 10, 15 years, the running backs are the afterthoughts. It's all just the quarterback discussion.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I believe it's like the last 12 running backs on the team that won the Super Bowl were all either on their rookie contracts or signed for something close to the veteran minimum. These teams, all the high-priced running backs, they're the ones on the outside looking in. But to, everyone's point about the 49ers, I don't think anyone would deny McCaffrey is like 30% of what they do on offense. With the whole thing doesn't work if it's Jordan Mason or Elijah Mitchell back there. And so maybe we will see a real throwback of sorts if the 49ers do come out on top.
Yeah, I mean, Drew Brees and Peyton Manning and Tom Brady and Russell Wilson. I mean, this is what's been dominating the NFL Super Bowls. Wasn't always like that in the past. All right, we will talk a little daily fantasy next.
.47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course, you're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back leads point one touchdown pass, right? You can't win MVP with one touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs, but I bet on them.
This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's one game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, 7th in assists, and 8th in field goal percentage not make the All-Star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the fourth quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the two biggest games of the two Super Bowls, one as a coordinator, one as a head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the fourth quarter. I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Welcome back to Fantasy Sports today on SportsGrid. A great way to play the Super Bowl is daily fantasy. For those of you who are not into sports wagering, maybe you're watching the show for fantasy purposes, but you are in luck because here on the show, we're going to give you the best opportunity to win, go over some of the salary pricing, see if you can make some money over on DraftKings, FanDuel, etc. And so, of course, for this discussion, we bring in Davis Maddock, who's probably got 7, 8, 10 lineups. I don't know. It's the final game of the NFL season. I'm guessing Davis is going to be fully invested in this. And, Davis, look, this is it, right? Like, this is the last chance to play daily fantasy in the NFL. Does it exist in the CFL and the USFL thing that they're combining? I have no idea. I couldn't even tell you one player in this league. So this is really the last shot, I would guess, to try to make $1 million or just have some fun playing daily fantasy.
I mean, look, Craig, I'm going to be there for the new UFL, by the way. They're combining the spring leagues. Craig, I don't know if you heard, but they've actually combined the two leagues. So now we actually are going to have, all the best players who are not good enough to be on a 53-man NFL roster. We're going to have them, playing here in the spring. The Birmingham Stallions, lifelong fan of the Birmingham Stallions. But you're right. This will be the last chance to play fantasy football to win $1 million. I think there are 3 different contests on DraftKings this weekend where there are $1 million awarded to first place. So make no mistake about it. This is serious money. We are going after it this weekend. And, I love the single game format for these contests. I mean, I find them very fascinating. Now, I find them very fascinating in the way that, like, your 7-year-old kid brother who wants to tell you about his new Star Wars action figure, it finds it very exciting. Like, it's very nerdy. It's very intricate. It's so much more about how the players combine, the ownerships of players combined, all of that. But it is, honestly, I would actually say single game NFL DFS might be my favorite form of NFL fantasy because it is so intricate. So I'm excited to dig into these salaries and the strategies here for the Super Bowl.
Okay, so let's get started here. And these prices are courtesy of DraftKings. Now, obviously, anybody who is building a lineup for the Super Bowl, Davis, is going to have to start and end with a decision on Christian McCaffrey because essentially, and look, I don't want to put this into the universe, but like the only way that McCaffrey doesn't cash on a team that wins is if he doesn't play a lot for some reason. I don't even want to say the reason why because I don't want that to happen, but that's like the only scenario here that you don't put $17,500 into a lineup with McCaffrey. I mean, he's averaging 23 fantasy points per game, but like it has to start and end with him. So I guess for this discussion, let's start and end with him because there's what scenario do you not have him in a lineup for the Super Bowl where he's been the most dominant factor in fantasy sports all season long? I just don't know which way to go. And by the way, these are courtesy of FanDuel, I should say. This is the FanDuel pricing here. McCaffrey, 17,500. Let's start with a building of a lineup with or without him. How do you do it?
I mean, you're right. Like, ultimately, what you decide to do with Christian McCaffrey, whether you're playing 1 lineup, 10 lineups, 150 lineups, however many you are playing, it does all come down to what you decide to do with McCaffrey. Historically, he actually has been even better in the postseason for the San Francisco 49ers. He played 98% of the snaps with 12 targets against Green Bay, played 91% of the snaps with 5 targets against Detroit. The same was true of his usage last offseason for San Francisco. I mean, he basically just did not sub out of the game. I guess he did a little bit against Seattle because they were winning by so much. But, really, actually, and this has just been true in any big game for the 49ers, there's no Eli Mitchell. There's no Jordan Mason. It is just all McCaffrey, really about the best workload that you were going to find. Now, the salary to get McCaffrey in these lineups is going to be fairly prohibitive. I mean, when you take McCaffrey, you are subjecting yourself to, you definitely can't take both quarterbacks with him. So if you take McCaffrey, you have to sacrifice one of Mahomes or Purdy. And regardless, you are going to have to take someone who is not a primary offensive piece for either team. So no Rice, Kelsey, Mahomes for the Chiefs, no Debo, Ayuk, Kittle, or Purdy for the 49ers. So you're heading into, do I want to take Kyle Juszczyk? Do I want to take Richie James? Do I want to take Sky Moore, who is probably going to be activated and elevated to the 53-man roster for the Kansas City Chiefs when we get to kickoff? That'll actually be mean, it's I really, in my life of playing these fantasy contests, I don't really remember a skill position player being legitimately questionable and actually playing in the Super Bowl, like where, we don't know if Jerick McKinnon is going to play in this game, and we're not going to know until 90 minutes before, which is just like it's just a pretty bizarre circumstance to be placed in. I'm going to side on, I don't really think you can go to war without Christian McCaffrey. I think he obviously, if this game goes over, I mean, he's really getting there. Like, if this game goes over the total of 47.5, it probably means he scored twice, probably means he catches 6 or 7 passes. And if this game goes under, it's sort of a converse way to think about it. And this is what I meant about talking to your little kid brother about Star Wars. That actually, if this game goes under and it's very low scoring, and let's say McCaffrey only gets 19 FanDuel points, but the game goes under, there's just going to be fewer fantasy points available for both teams. It means there's fewer touchdowns, fewer receptions, fewer yards gained, fewer field goals kicked, yada, yada, so on and so forth. So McCaffrey's 19 points actually, in a weird way, become almost more valuable if he's the second or third highest scoring player in the game. So I do think at the end of the day, I don't want to be in a spot where I'm making a decision to not go in with him in this spot.
Right. And so, Davis, the next part of the conversation is, picking the quarterback, where Mahomes is 15,000 and Purdy's 14,000. But Davis, isn't that irrelevant? Those prices for the quarterbacks are irrelevant because whoever wins the game in the Super Bowl is going to be predominantly because of one of these two guys. It feels like McCaffrey has to be in a lineup. If you use Purdy, you're betting on the 49ers. If you use Mahomes, you're probably betting on Kansas City. Isn't it that cut and dry at this point? Whichever quarterback you pick is you're picking to win the game?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately you probably just really want to be correlating these guys with their teammates. Like, the interesting thing about Purdy is that he just very rarely goes over his attempts number. It's kind of one of the things that I was looking at for prop betting this season. He doesn't go over 31.5 passing attempts, which obviously is his number, all that often. He's only gone over that number 3 times in the entire season, which is kind of crazy to get to the Super Bowl and have your passing attempt number be something that you have only gotten over on 3 occasions. I side with Mahomes in either lineup. One, because I think we will see him run a little bit more, as I talked about in my best bet at the end of hour 1. So I think that you can probably bump up whatever your fantasy point projection for him is a little bit, but also because of what you said about the winning team being correlated towards the quarterback, and just thinking through all the permutations. If I knew that either quarterback was going to have, let's call it 42 passing attempts, which is like a lot for the Super Bowl. You're not going to see guys get that high all that often. I'm thinking that the fantasy point expectation for Mahomes with those passing attempts is going to be greater than if Purdy has to get into a spot where the 49ers are trying to throw that often. And the other thing about not taking Purdy is I can actually see a game win or loss for the 49ers where they score effectively on offense, and Purdy ends up being like the 3rd or 4th highest scoring 49er, because obviously Debo can do it as a rusher. Kittle can do it on really limited volume. We've actually seen a game this season where George Kittle had 3 targets, 3 receptions, and 3 touchdowns, which is going to limit, obviously the total available amount of passing yards that Purdy can have. So again, very in-depth here. But I think I would ultimately side with Mahomes and a couple of his cheaper pass catchers as opposed to trying to get multiple really expensive 49ers into one lineup.
Now, Travis Kelce is 13,000 on FanDuel, and you mentioned George Kittle. To me, Davis, it feels like Kittle is a big wild card in this game, where I think that for the 49ers to win, and you painted a picture with Debo having a good game, yes, or Ayuk, but using Kelce and using that 13,000, leaving Kittle out, probably the narrative to go. But as you mentioned, Kittle, over the course of this, 17-game fantasy season, has had the best tight end game in fantasy like 3 or 4 times. It's just that he's done nothing in the other games.
You're definitely correct about that. I actually agree that Kittle is probably one of the X factors for this game. Kittle has like a pretty high correlation to when he has a good game. The 49ers also have a good game. Ayuk has had big games where they've lost, but you kind of look at Kittle's big games and they correlate pretty heavily with wins. And, Kansas City, if you were going to say what is a weak point of their defense, you definitely would say the linebacking group. The corners are like phenomenal. The safeties have played very well all season, but the linebackers are kind of the spot where you can get at them a little bit. And because of the insane rushing game that the 49ers have, this comes all the way back around to McCaffrey. You can't, against the 49ers, do what a lot of teams do against the Chiefs and the Bills, which is you sub out an extra linebacker for a defensive back. You can't do that you can't have 4-man boxes. You can't have 5-man boxes against the 49ers. Or McCaffrey will just average 7 yards per carry and you'll never get the ball. You'll just get completely suffocated. So I actually do really agree with your point. I think Kittle, Debo, and Rashee Rice are going to be my 3 favorite single game DFS plays on any site that you're playing these contests on.
Yeah, and by the way, great contest both on FanDuel and DraftKings. So make sure if you're going to play to get some good advice coming up here at 6:40 p.m. Eastern when the Super Bowl kicks off. But just a couple of months from now, we'll be focused in on the upcoming NFL draft. All 4 of us panelists will weigh in on what we saw during the college football season and wonder whether or not some of these quarterbacks can translate into the NFL. That's coming up next as Fantasy Sports Today continues on Super Bowl Sunday.
.47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course. You're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back leagues point 1 touchdown pass, right? You can't win MVP with 1 touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs, but I bet on them.
This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's one game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, 7th in assists, and 8th in field goal percentage not make the All-Star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the fourth quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the 2 biggest games of the 2 Super Bowls, one as a coordinator, one as a head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the fourth quarter. And I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Welcome back to Fantasy Sports Today as we turn the page on the NFL season from a fantasy football perspective as the Super Bowl is coming up later today. Very quickly, we're going to be moving over to the NFL draft, which, by the way, is only a few months away. Craig Mish, along with Joe Pisapia, Matt Stryker, and Davis Maddock, as we take a look at that upcoming NFL draft. And certainly, gentlemen, there's going to be a lot of quarterback discussion. What we normally see this time of the year is, this quarterback could be good. It's possible this guy goes in the first round, and March comes along, and all of a sudden, it's like the helium begins. Players go from the third round to the first round. Players go from the second round to top 5 picks in the NFL draft. And Joe, this is a common theme every single season. What is an uncommon theme is sort of trying to figure out which of these helium quarterbacks are actually any good versus which are desperate teams that just need a quarterback for the future. And I think that's an important part of the discussion.
Well, there's a lot of desperate teams that need quarterback play. I think we knew that. And we said it going into this season. I mean, on the Sunday Fantasy Sports Today, we talked about, hey, be careful in Superflex leagues because quarterback play is going to be rough. Be careful with some of these offenses that have a lot of questions because if some of these guys fail, they're going to drag a lot of those pieces down with them in fantasy. And what did we see? Exactly that. And Caleb Williams is the top guy from USC on most people's boards right now. And I know it's funny because Davis and I think, are in the minority in our quarterback rankings, but we're on the same page. Williams is the first, if you want to say by default, okay. But I think what you see with Williams is that modern day style quarterback, the guy that's got speed, the guy that's got agility, the guy that can get out of the pocket, make plays. He is that playmaking guy, and he is that video game-esque quarterback that we have seen start to filter into the NFL. There are some questions. I think maybe the season was a little below expectations, but expectations in all fairness were set very high. There were some low points too. I think that game against Notre Dame, I think that was a kind of a big red flag. I think you saw some of the weaknesses of Caleb Williams in that game. But Davis, I think it's hard at the, when coming into this draft season to not have him at the top of that board regardless. So why is he number one for you on yours?
I mean, I've watched Caleb Williams pretty closely since he was 18 years old. Actually, kind of thrown into the fire. He got Spencer Rattler, who was supposed to be the number 1 overall pick. I mean, you want to talk about aging myself here. Rattler was supposed to be the number 1 overall pick 2 years ago. He got benched against the University of Texas. Caleb Williams, 18 years old, comes in, leads Oklahoma down the field, 3 consecutive scoring drives. Now, what he put on tape this final year at USC, you're going to have some people who are like, I don't know. A lot of what happened was, against Pac-12 defenses, outside of structure. It's going to be hard to duplicate those things in the NFL. Honestly, I don't really buy it. Caleb Williams, from any kind of like advanced type of data you look at, he's going to be one of the best prospects that you've ever seen. He's huge. He can run. He really never turns the ball over, which I think is one of the great things that I like to see from these prospects who are playing in these really pass-heavy air raid systems. Like a lot of turnovers it's kind of like the number. It's really the thing about Zach Wilson that stood out was how easy his life was at BYU, but he still turned the ball over way more than you would have anticipated. And I think we see this happen with a lot of quarterbacks who are supposed to go number 1 overall is once the process is over, there's a lot of nitpicking that goes on. And don't get me wrong, his final year at USC, you don't want to go 7-5 at USC. You don't want that to be the final memory. But let's put it like this. Had Caleb Williams, had the NFL and the NCAA said, you know what, Caleb, you're just too good to be here. We're just going to let you go after your sophomore year. You win the Heisman. We're just going to let you go in the draft. It would have been very hard for anyone to, at that point, say, oh, well, this guy can't be the number 1 overall pick. And weirdly enough, I think the fact that the Bears are the team that have the number 1 overall pick, and because Fields is such a divisive player, has actually led into this criticism of Caleb Williams, where because it's a very finite thing, everyone can look at it and go, all right, I can just take Caleb Williams, who I saw lose to the University of Washington and look really bad and was crying on the sideline with his mom, or I can take Justin Fields, a guy I've seen, score 40 points for my fantasy team. Which guy do I want? But Caleb, to me, I think he's going to come in and immediately be the 12th best quarterback in the NFL right away.
Yeah, it's interesting, Matt. Marvin Harrison Sr. was a player that was drafted in the first round a lot in fantasy football, of course, with Peyton Manning at quarterback. His son on Ohio State is projected to be one of the top 3 picks in this coming NFL draft. And a different player, too, can get deep, can go over the middle. Had a fantastic career at Ohio State. And, given the nature of just how fantasy has turned into a wide receiver league, meaning that if you don't have a couple of good ones, you ain't winning fantasy. You could get away with no running back sometime, but you can't get away with not having a good wide receiver. I wonder if you think that Marvin Harrison's NFL career could even come close to his dad's, which was obviously a Hall of Fame career.
Well, that's a tough thing, and I think we have to be careful of doing that, especially in sports punditry, is to know that the sons are not the fathers and the fathers are not the sons, and let's have the conversation about the player and let him stand in his own cleats. Joe and I talk about this a lot, and Joe mentions it in his Black Book series about comparing players to their peers and then getting a better understanding of where they rank within the position. So when Davis gave that dynamite insight on how Williams is going to impact how people draft, I do believe this player can do the same thing as well. And when you start to think about landing spots, and we had a conversation about possible quarterback movement, it begins to portend a much bigger conversation that I'll throw in Joe's lap as to how do we draft and what we're looking for. Am I hitting it on the head with how the Black Book would approach something like this, Joe?
Yeah, and I would say early and often when it comes to Marvin Harrison, because he is possibly the easiest lock we've seen in quite some time. I mean, everything with this kid is just right. In terms of the head, in terms of the feet, in terms of the hands, all of it. When you watch the highlights of Marvin Harrison, you see he's open by 5 yards all the time. And it's, like he's playing at Ohio State. He's playing at a place that's produced wide receiver after wide receiver the last few years. All of the recent rookies of the year have been from Ohio State. Have you seen the trend? Get ready to go bet him for Rookie of the Year as early as you possibly can, as soon as he gets drafted. I think he might land at 4 for Arizona if the board stays the way it is now. And I think it's just a tremendous investment, Craig, for Marvin Harrison on any team, wherever he ends up. But 4 to me makes the most sense. They need a wide receiver, especially with Hollywood Brown kind of, in question whether or not he's going to return. You have Trey McBride there. I think it's a matter of get that big alpha dog wide receiver with Kyler Murray, and then maybe he can fulfill the promise of that contract.
Yeah, and the next quarterback that's projected at least to go in the draft, this could change. I mean, Jayden Daniels could easily go ahead of Drake May. But Davis, this is, Drake May is going to be the danger zone of the NFL draft because he very well could turn out to be great. Now, there's a lot of conference realignment, and so discussion on conferences is not going to be the same 5 years from now as it has been for the last 5 years or the last 10 years. But Davis, as you know, the Atlantic Coast Conference, generally speaking, is, not the greatest conference for defense in, as it translates to the National Football League. Now, obviously, Deshaun Watson has had a great career. Trevor Lawrence came out of the ACC as well at Clemson. But a little bit harder to gauge when a player's coming out of North Carolina. He's going to have everything going for him physically. It's just a matter of will that translate over to the NFL, where it is not a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think the worst thing for Drake May is that people are going to watch those highlights of him running around there in the Tar Heel blue, and the thing that's going to come to their minds is who is the last athletic, tall, strong running quarterback who was drafted in the first round at the University of North Carolina, a guy who is like just the punchline these days in Mitchell Trubisky. Now, to me, May, way, way better than Trubisky is. May is younger than he ever, May is younger than Trubisky was, started more games than Trubisky did in college. Honestly, it would not surprise me at all, though, if May ends up being the better pro quarterback than Caleb Williams. To me, I kind of think it is it's a 2-guy draft class of quarterback, 3-guy draft class in terms of offensive skill position players. I think the range of outcomes for Jayden Daniels, Michael Penix, JJ McCarthy, these guys, I think is far wider. Probably the thing you would not anticipate just looking at Drake May would be how good of a runner he was to the University of North Carolina. 16 rushing touchdowns on 302 attempts. Obviously, yards per carry is kind of hard to go by because sack yardage is taken away from that. In college, I think, in what I have watched of Drake May, and I'm not that deep into scouting stuff yet here, where it's kind of going to be what happens for me after the Super Bowl. I think it's a non-zero chance, actually. And I don't know how many people have put this out there, that May goes first, that actually Drake May ends up being the guy that the Bears take. I think it is that close. I think he is that good. Also, would not surprise me to see the Bears try and trade down to 2, looking at these 2 guys saying they're both great. And really whichever one we get is strong enough. And then I think there is a fairly decent drop to Jaden Daniels after that.
Yeah, and Daniels, Joe, very well traveled in college football. Played, of course, at a very high level at LSU. And look, it's just a new day in the NFL. I mean, let's just be honest. When players were drafted in the NFL, you watch the highlight films. We would watch it on ESPN. It used to be on Saturday morning or Sunday morning, whatever it was. You'd watch the film. It was all on one team. I mean, this guy Daniels, you could show highlights from like 7 teams, even going back to high school, right? He's played in so many different places. But realistically speaking, again, as you said, Joe, earlier in the show, the desperation of the quarterback position makes Daniels a rock-solid first-round pick, and he has more tools maybe than anybody that's going to go in the first round, but there will be some questions as to whether or not that translates to the next level.
Yeah, I think tools is a really good way to put it, and I think you nailed it right there. And because he has bounced around, there are going to be some questions that follow him. He ended up at LSU with a lot of good weapons around him, and that certainly elevated his play. It reminds me a little bit of a narrative that we built about Joe Burrow once upon a time at LSU too, right? A guy bounced around a little bit, but look how good he was at LSU. And obviously, when you have guys like Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson on the same team, you're going to be pretty good. So there were some questions there. Now, I'm not saying he's Joe Burrow. I think Joe Burrow was a much more finished product than Daniels is. But Daniels has the tools, and I think that's the thing. You're looking at a lot of these NFL teams, and these GMs are looking for that. But I'm kind of where Davis is, where you watch Drake May. Yeah, maybe the competition isn't quite the same as some of the other guys you're going to compare to. But at the same time, you watch him out in space. You watch how, when May gets flushed out of the pocket, how good he is throwing the football on the run. And I think that's something that a lot of teams are going to value as well. So May, to me, I think is the safer investment. And if there's any movement there and Washington moves up, I think Washington moves up to take Caleb Williams because of the ties that he has there. And then I think you might even see a 3-way trade potentially with the Bears trading Fields and then moving to 2 to select somebody like May. So it's going to be a wild draft. And we haven't even gotten to the guys like Brock Bowers, who many people are calling potentially that next Travis Kelce. Davis, when you watch tape on Brock Bowers, I'm sure as you're getting caught up, you're going to see a guy who's really good after the catch, who's really good after contact. He gets those Kelce comparisons for a reason, and he has played in the SEC. He has played in big games, in playoff games, and national championship games. There's a lot to like with Brock Bowers, the latest in a long line of young tight ends who are making their mark in the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if Kyle Pitts didn't exist, if we didn't just in recent memory have the evidence of a tight end who everyone told us was going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread going top 10 in the NFL draft, there would be the collective experience of waiting for Brock Bowers to be in the NFL. People would be even more excited about him. I mean, I think Bowers actually maybe has an argument for even being better than Kyle Pitts was in college, Craig. And I know that's hard to hear for your Gators, but I think it might be true. Bowers really is that good.
Yeah, and also Bowers did not have elite quarterback play at the University of Georgia too. Did it without that. He does seem to be a surefire, solid tight end in the NFL. All right, solid pick coming up next. Matt Stryker is going to tell us his favorite bet in this.
.47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course, you're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back weeks point 1 touchdown pass, right? You can't win MVP with 1 touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs, but I bet on them.
This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's one game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, 7th in assists, and 8th in field goal percentage not make the All-Star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the fourth quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the two biggest games of the two Super Bowls, one is the coordinator, one is the head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the fourth quarter. And I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Welcome back to Fantasy Sports Today. Our supersized edition of the show continues. Craig Mish, Davis Maddock, Joe Pisapia, and the one and only Matt Stryker's got a full day ahead of him on the show today. I know he's got that. Kids going on, Super Bowl. It's got to be a big day. But Matt, want to get your opinion here on your favorite bet for the upcoming Super Bowl. I know certainly there's a lot of different options. Do you have a prop out there that has piqued your interest on Super Bowl Sunday?
Yeah, actually, I looked for something that I felt would fade all of the noise. We've been talking now for the better part of 2 hours about how when things become too public, that affects the numbers. For me, I'm keeping it simple, stupid. Largest lead of the game for either team will be under 14.5 points. Based off of all the numbers surrounding this game, it does not tell me that any team is going to get up in a wild margin over 14.5 points. I do want to say to wagerers out there, especially new ones, don't be scared off by something like minus 125. Remember that numbers are a language. We need to look at those numbers as a percentage of the opportunity that it's going to go in our favor. The reason they're asking minus 125 is because there's a 55% chance that we are going to win. So have a threshold in your mind, because once it gets too high, there's no return on profit. So for me, that's the way it goes. If they shut down McCaffrey, look for Kittle or Jennings to be the way this goes down. Craig?
Yep, understood, Matt. And, obviously, can't wait to hear all of your content and watch your content for the upcoming baseball season as well. So, Matt, I know you're getting ready to have a big day ahead of you. Appreciate you doing the show with us today, and certainly we'll catch up again soon.
Absolutely, and thank you to everyone. Again, Davis, you were kind to me the first time we ever worked together. Craig, I'm still going to always be in awe of you. And Joe, you're the straw that stirs the drink. I know you guys are just going to kill it in the remaining 2 hours. And all the great programming here on the network today.
Yeah, we got 2 more hours to go. We'll bring Joe and Davis back as we continue on in this edition of Fantasy Sports Today, Super Bowl Sunday. Don't go away.